So just a little bit about myself. I I graduated from Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington in 1962, ancient history there. Um, and I went into the Peace Corps. At that time, it was just starting out. And I was in a group called Nigeria 7. We were the seventh group to be sent to Nigeria. And we trained at Columbia University in New York, which was great for me because I'd never been to New York, and I was in Spokane, Washington, and it was a real cultural difference. But so we were there for the summer of '63, and at that time, it's interesting and it's also ironic and sad. At that time, Nigeria, and I give you a little bit of background on Nigeria. It is every fifth person in Africa lives in Nigeria. And there is a map in the book that you've probably seen, so you kind of get an idea of the country. But at that time, Nigeria was the great hope for parliamentary democracy in Africa, because it was the largest country population-wise. It was a former British colony. It was becoming independent. It was one of the earlier ones. In Ghana was first, I believe, and then Nigeria, and then the winds of change, were blowing across Africa at that time, and one by one these countries became independent. And examples are the Congo. I don't know if you remember people like Patrice Lumumba and all that, but the sad part is that was the great hope, and now it's turned into like one of the worst places in Africa. The great scourge of Africa is, graft, corruption, government corruption, and also the other part of it, the background is that when the map of Europe, in 1895, I put this in my book, but in 1895, there was a conference in Berlin where the colonial powers all got together. They looked at the globe, and they looked at Africa and other countries and developing. Well, they weren't countries they weren't nations, I should say. And they had names, but they just, like cutting up a pie. They said, well, will you take this, and you're going to take this. And Nigeria was English, so British colony, so the English were, it kind of went, the choice was based on who had colonized it first, kind of like the Belgians were in the Congo. And getting down to the more granular of actually Nigeria, just to show you part of the problem was that Nigeria really never was a country. You have to realize it's when they created these countries in Africa, they didn't really follow any kind of natural boundaries, which would have been things like ethnicity, for example. Certain people congregated and lived in certain areas, and in Nigeria, for example, in the north, it was all Muslim, and these were the houses. The people are called the House of Fulanis, and they've always dominated Nigeria just because of their sheer force of numbers. And to the south, on the west, you have an area dominated by the Yorubas, and to the east is the Igbos. And if you heard about the Biafran War, I guess you did probably from the book, the Igbos tried to become independent in 1967, 66, 67. And that started a war because the North did not want them to go. The North was land-bound, and it had no access to the ocean at all. And it was the poorest part of the country, the least educated part of the country. And the reason for that is that the missionaries, when they came in the 1400s with the Portuguese, they even, I know the slavery part is a big, that was called the Windward Coast, and part of the attraction there was slaves, and that's why they went there. But they also, the missionaries came there, and the missionaries got off the boats and stayed there, and at that time, that whole Windward Coast was considered the white man's grave. It's not like East Africa, you know, Kenya and these wonderful highlands and where you have these great vistas, and no, Nigeria's not like that at all. It's all mangrove, you know, down south. But as you go north, it gets better. And it finally borders onto the Sahara Desert, basically, in the far north. But you had those three ethnic groups in those different parts, and to try to put that together in some kind of artificial boundary just didn't work. And I mean, it never has worked. And it's the same problem. It is what it is. And it's very sad because, as I said, there was this great hope, and Nigeria still has a lot of potential. I haven't given up on it, but it's just one of those things that you know, if past is prologue, you know, it's not going to get any better.
Do you go back?
No, it's too dangerous. You can't go. No one in this room would dare go to Nigeria because
My daughter did
she did
last year.
last year.
Yeah.
Okay.
Vacation or for?
No, to get her nursing license, because she went to Kenya.
She went to Kenya,
Yeah,
but she had to go to Nigeria first.
she went to Kenya. She is a nurse
Right.
and couldn't practice because she didn't have her license, so she went to Nigeria by bus. Oh,
my
I could have
gosh.
killed her.
Wait, you told you this after, I hope. Yeah. Let's hear about this
Yeah.
story.
That's an interesting.
Anyway, she got her license and then went back to Kenya. And
She actually had to go to Nigeria to get a license. Okay. That's an interesting story. I don't know anyone that goes to Nigeria anymore.
yeah.
It's just too. It's
Is there
too.
a battle over oil there as well?
There is that. That's why in the east is where the oil is, and that's where the Igbos are, and they were the ones that wanted to become independent, and but the north didn't want that to happen because they would lose that revenue because it was divided among the whole. They do have a federal government, and so that was kind of that is the background of Nigeria, and it is the background of many African countries, and that's why there's so many problems. The whole idea of a nation is an alien concept, but people tried. Like I taught English at a school in the north called the Government Technical Training School, and we had a rule. We had there's 280 dialects of different languages in Nigeria, and so we had kids from all over the country, but we had a strict rule that English only, just the opposite of the kind of dialogue that's going on today about speaking Spanish in America and that sort of thing. But the purpose was that to try to bring some kind of integration, to have one common language that at least the educated people could use, and if you caught a kid, the rule was kids could be punished if they were caught speaking their dialect, their native tongue. But anyway, I taught English, their American English. The kids used to come up to me and say, "Sir, what is a guy?" Because they'd never heard that expression. I'd maybe say something like that during a classroom, and then they'd walk by me and sometimes they'd whisper, "Water, water, water, water." We say water, the British say water, and the kids were used to the British. The school that I went to was run by the British, actually. The old colonialists. They were good people, many of them. Some weren't, but So anyway, the problem when this book is set right when that Biafran War begins, and it basically sets the background, the drama. That's what I try to do in the book: set the drama to have it take place in a time of high tension, and this kind of the contrast is from the kind of where my protagonist is. He's on a high plateau, and to paraphrase Isaac Dinesen, someone asked me about what books in Africa are about Africa are good, and that they hadn't read many. That is the classic, I think. You probably saw that, Out of Africa, the movie, but the book is so much better than the movie. The movie's really not that great, I didn't think. She was really a lyric poet. She had a farm in Kenya, and in the first part of my book, I quote her because it kind of brings out the lyric quality of Africa. If I know a song of Africa, that's where I got my title. If I know a song of Africa, I thought of the giraffe and the African new moon lying on her back, of the plows in the fields and the sweaty faces of the coffee pickers. Does Africa know a song of me? Would the air over the plain quiver with a color that I had on? Or the children invent a new game in which my name was? Or the full moon cast a shadow over the gravel of the drive that was like me? Or would the eagles of Nong look out for me? Isaac Dinesen, Out of Africa. So I highly recommend that book if you haven't read it. Excuse me.
That's your cover.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I must say, my daughter designed the cover. She works for Marriott and headquarters in Bethesda now, and she designed this cover. She designed all the covers of my 3 books. So I'm pleased with that.
And she's newly engaged. Nice.
What'd you say, Diane?
She's newly engaged.
And newly engaged, yes, then we're happy, even though he is a lawyer.
Ron is a lawyer, and she's a lawyer.
Just joshing her.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know I don't want to stand up here and lecture about Africa, really, or Nigeria. I'd be happy to answer any questions, but I think maybe we should get a dialogue going. Is that what we wanted to do, or I hadn't planned any?
I think we've got a lot of questions looking
Okay,
there.
okay, sure.
I have a question, and I may be confusing Nigeria with Kenya, but I thought I had read in the last year that the Nigerian economy now was doing really well. Is that, and it was like in some micro area, but I thought they were doing well, and that kind of conflicts with the chaos that seems to still
Right.
be there.
Oh, well, I have to say I'm not up to date on all of, the Nigerian economy, but I do read the Nigerian posts on the web, and I have a website called A Song of it is called after the book, A Song of Africa, on Facebook. I have about 4,000 fans, I guess, and so I try to keep up a little bit so I can post things, about Nigeria. But yeah, there are successes. I know there are successes, and that's probably correct what you're saying. What do they call it? The trying to encourage micro businesses.
It sounded really hopeful.
Yeah.
In fact, it said something about the rate of growth in Nigeria was faster than anywhere else in Africa, and they might have been even comparing it to other developed countries, and it sounded really encouraging. But I'm wondering, is the strife now that's going on now, is that still a reflection of the tribal, like Hausa versus
Yes,
the Igbo,
right,
and
yeah.
those
There's this whole
conflicts
thing
still, or?
Right. The whole thing about Boko Haram is Boko Haram is Hausa for Western education is forbidden. That's a rough translation of it, and that's exactly what I was doing there. Okay, we were trying to teach the kids and modernize them, and
Back to 1967,
Right.
wherever
Right.
you were there. Perhaps we can go back to like what inspired you to do this. I know you were with the Peace Corps. I know you were with a telecommunications company. And at what point did you decide that you wanted to write about this story?
well, it's kind of like you can take the boy out of Africa, but you can never take Africa out of the boy, and that was me. You know, when I was obsessed with it. It's kind of like a PSTD that I think I had, and I was working it out in a creative way, trying to, and I guess that's kind of my best explanation. But I had it's an emotional thing. I had a lot of emotions, people that I knew and really cared for.
How long were you there?
2 years. We had a 2-year tour as Peace Corps volunteers. I was there from '63 to '65. So the war was just starting when I left. Okay, but I know a number of Peace Corps volunteers that were there, like in '67, and I know one Peace Corps volunteer who was almost killed. He was a teacher in a village. This is down south in the kind of the triple canopy forest, and he was a well-liked teacher and respected. And he was teaching school, and the Jeeps came, and they just told him to stop teaching, close the school. And so this was the federal government. Now this is the North, okay? And well, the army of Nigeria was really run by Northerners. You have to go back a little bit. It's detailed in the book, in the preface, that the way the war started was that the most powerful man in Nigeria at that time was a man by the name of Alhaji Ahmadu Bello, and he had a desert palace in Kaduna. I actually went there, and he greeted us when we came. But he was a spiritual and secular leader of the North, which was, again, the most powerful part of the country, because it had the most people and basically just sheer numbers, and Muslims. They were all, one religion. So they had that strength, and so he was although not the titular ruler. At the time, the president was a guy named Nnamdi Azikiwe, who had been educated in the United States. But he wasn't the real power. The real power was in the North with the Ahmadu Bello character, who he actually impressed me a lot. He gave me an ostrich feathered fan. He gave each one of us, there were about 7 of us. He was welcoming us to teach in our various schools. And I remember his parting words for us were, we want progress, but we want it slowly. And that was a lot. That sent us a message to us, They were afraid of change, and they still are. They're afraid of modernization. This is in the North, because it threatens their way of life in so many ways. And basically, what happened to start the war was a group of Igbo officers and it's detailed there to some extent. Igbo officers attacked in the night. They did a sneak attack on the palace of Ahmadu Bello, and they actually practiced it a couple times, but then they did the final time they did it and they killed him. And so that really sparked the tribal rivalries, because first of all, they were from the east, the Igbos. They're killing a northerner. They were Christians, he was a Muslim. He was a spiritual leader of the North, and so that was a spark that started the whole war. And at one time, they were killing so many Igbos in the North that they were sending them back down to Enugu, which is the capital of the North, in railroad boxcars. And it was a message: don't mess with us. And that was like the last. Then that got the Igbos to decide to secede or secede. So anyway, that's how it started, and that tension remains. I don't care what you say or what they say.
The flight of the children, was that pretty close to the reality that you,
Oh
that
yeah,
you just
yeah,
spoke?
yeah. All that
The starvation.
in the book
and
is based on real events and real people, actually, but it's fiction, you know. So, I mean, an author has to have something to base a character on, and usually it's someone that you try to make up in your mind. But I'm sure that every author takes someone as a model somewhere.
Tell us about that. I thought that you started out as Larry, perhaps, and ended up as Paul.
No,
So,
I was more like, well, you know, that's not wrong. It's not totally wrong. It's not totally wrong. It's kind of a schizophrenic thing, I guess, when you're,
it's an evolution.
yeah, when you're a writer or any kind of art, I guess you kind of have to express things some way, and it is kind of schizophrenic, I guess. Two minds.
But two different situations. You go into a situation with a point of view, you experience it, and then you come out of it seeing it completely different.
Well, I didn't necessarily intend that, but when you think about it, one thing I learned about being in Africa, and I think this would be true of any country, if you live in another country for more than a year, 2 years, and especially if it's a developing country, as in my case anyway, you start to think like the people in the country, and you start to understand why they look at America in a different way than I was starting to see America through their eyes. And it wasn't negative totally, but it was more like material things, and obviously political changes that I thought I was beginning to develop political ideology, I suppose. And many Peace Corps volunteers have more problems going back to America. They have what they call cultural shock. You have two cultural shocks. The first one is when you go to the country and you see things that you just can't believe. And then when you come back to America and you say to yourself, I don't fit here anymore. You know, it's kind of like you can't go, Thomas Wolfe, you can't go home again. But eventually you get over it. In my case, I went, I was, after this really wonderful teaching experience in Africa, I was going to be drafted, and I had the draft board after me, and they sent me a postcard, you know, at my little school up in the northern Nigeria. You have 14 days to get back to America. You're going to be 1A, okay? So at that time, I'm sure that the Spokane draft board considered anybody who went into the Peace Corps probably a commie or some kind of idealist or something that, but certainly not, in other words, avoiding the draft, somebody who wanted to avoid the draft. And that was not my intention, really. But when I came back, in order to avoid the draft, the only job I could get was as a teacher. And I was kind of got this job at the last minute teaching in a junior high in an inner city, Tacoma, Washington. And it was a totally integrated school, which was great. But they thought I could, because I'd been in Africa, I could do anything, you know. But Africa had really spoiled me for teaching in America. And I made it through the year, finished my contract, but then I basically volunteered for the draft because I figured I wasn't going to do this for the rest of my life. So I went from the Peace Corps to the War Corps, and I ended up in Vietnam. But that's another story for another book.
Are you going to get one of those certificates just before
yeah.
Thanksgiving?
Yeah, yeah.
For those of you who may not know, which group is it?
It's a
VF
DAR.
DAR, which is, we met today, and we're acknowledging the Situate people who fought in the Vietnam War. So there's going to be an acknowledgement. Was it the 20th? It's just before Tuesday,
I
I
think
think.
it's going to be at a meeting. Joan Powers told me it was going to be at a meeting, and then they were going to hand out these certificates.
I saw them today. They're quite nice.
Oh, you did? Oh, okay. Well, I look forward to that.
Just by way of recognition. Nice.
What is
Very
that?
nice. Well deserved.
Oh,
Yes.
thank you. Thank you.
Well deserved.
But
Why didn't you write about the reality of what you saw instead of, well, this was lovely, but it's so interesting to hear about your perspective of being in Africa and being in the Peace Corps and seeing all the tribes, and that to me is the reality to put forward would be really interesting.
It's a good question. I never thought of it. And it's kind of a, if you go on the description that I get, the way they, Amazon, for example, they categorize books. And my book is kind of considered a travel book. And and not only a travel, it's an adventure book, travel, love story, the different categories. But there's a guy named Paul Thoreau who was in the Peace Corps who did write, who has written. If you haven't read that, you might want to.
Another Thoreau read that.
This is Paul Thoreau, okay, and he's quite famous, but he does exactly what you're talking about. There's one new book out called something like Last Stop Before Benghazi, not Benghazi, but some junction in Africa. I didn't know the African country, but he almost got killed doing travel writing over there. He got really sick. So, any other questions or comments?
When it sort of follows up on a question Michelle had, which is, so when did you get the spark about this story and these characters? And then from that point, how long did it take you to finish your book?
It took me a while because I got a start on it, and I was working in Washington, D.C., and I was really in raising a family, young family, and I was kind of focused on practical things. But we went up to my mother-in-law, who's deceased now, but she used to have a place on. She would rent a place in West Hampton, New York, and I went up there, and I stayed with her like on my vacations when I can get out of Washington, and that's what really kind of got me thinking about. It was the place that kind of got me the juices flowing back to Africa.
Who is your favorite character?
Mine in the book, I guess Paul.
Why?
Because he is kind of a no-nonsense sort of a person who wants there to be progress, but he has to work within the bounds of the society, and but also a human being, and very much sympathetic to the Nigerian people.
What's your next book going to be? I know you've got a couple over there
Right.
that I want to check out, but have you got the spark for the next one?
I do kind of, yeah, but it's I seem to be stuck either between in the 18th century, like with Phyllis, or kind of the World War II era.
If you haven't read Phyllis Wheatley, it's wonderful, because you really don't get a full sense of what was going on in Boston prior to the Revolutionary War. and the characters come to life. You never realize that you're reading a play.